Hello, everyone. I'm Katarina Colon, an attorney in Husch Blackwell's labor and employment practice with a focus on healthcare and education industries. I'm also co-lead of our diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace sub-practice of our labor and employment practice. We are excited to kick off our Alumni Academy with today's session on DE&I legal strategy success and discussions surrounding ESG. We are delighted to offer these training opportunities for alumni of the firm. We also offer updates through our private LinkedIn group and alumni microsite. Links to those are provided in the webinar console. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit via the question box. We will try to answer all questions during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. A PDF of our brief presentation is available in the program materials folder. However, today's program will primarily be a conversation, so I encourage you all to sit back and enjoy. This program has been approved for legal education hours. For live attendees, report your hours by clicking on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. That's all for our housekeeping items, so let's get started. Today, our wonderful panelists will be discussing their experiences with diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as issues related to ESG, and how you can drive a DEI and ESG strategy within your organization. Joining me today is Brooke Gubin, Head of ESG and Sustainability and Managing Director at Cerberus Capital Management. Sky Parr, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Strategist and Husch Blackwell alum. And finally, Melissa Williams, an attorney in our labor and employment practice with a focus in the financial services industry. And I'm actually going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves a little bit more, just so you can get to know them and hear about their experiences in their respective industries. So if Melissa Williams would please start.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katarina. And hello, everyone. Really happy to be here and to be connecting with all of you on this topic. Again, my name is Melissa Williams. I'm in the Labor and Employment Group here at Husch Blackwell, and actually sort of returned to the firm after almost a decade in-house at an insurance and financial services company called CUNA Mutual Group in Madison, Wisconsin. While I was at CUNA Mutual Group, I was in litigation and also employment counsel for the company. And it was during a period of time where the company was building out a DEI legal strategy and a DEI organization within the company and making DEI a corporate value. In addition to that, of course, there were multiple changes within the social landscape of our country with Me Too, Time's Up, George Floyd, all sorts of things that occurred during that period of time that had companies taking a second look at their policies, procedures, how they approach DEI, how they talked about DEI with individuals within their companies who were not diverse, and ensuring that they were moving about that in a way that was workable for the company and was encouraging of the goals that they had to meet as it related to DEI. So building out that legal strategy was one of my main focuses. And now that I'm back with the firm, I am focusing on that for clients and helping clients navigate this area as well. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Brooke, would you mind providing an introduction?
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks. Nice to be here. So as noted, I head up the ESG and sustainability work at Cerberus Capital Management. We are an alternative asset manager with 9 different investment strategies, ranging from private equity, real estate, finance, non-performing loans. We have an entire division that sort of buys banks and other financial institutions. So, it's very wide ranging when it comes to the kind of ESG issues that we deal with. We have about $60 billion under management, and we sit across 27 offices with about almost 1,000 employees at this point. So my role is fairly wide ranging and, encompasses sort of following the ESG regulatory and compliance environment, our own reporting on ESG issues, investor relations as they relate to ESG, following and supporting all 9 of our different investment strategies when it comes to how they incorporate ESG into their work. Operational management, and by which I mean when we have a control position in a company, supporting that company in integrating and applying, or creating an ESG strategy that's effective and appropriate for that company, and then also leading the sustainability initiatives within our own company. And from that perspective, it's kind of interesting because I'm the first person to have this role. I started a year ago, so I've sort of been doing all of the development of the ESG strategy, both within our management company and then, at all of our portfolio companies as well. So it's, a lot of different sort of real economy company perspectives, and then also financial institution. Before this, I was working in sustainability at Columbia University at their Center on Sustainable Investment. And prior to that, I was a banking lawyer practicing at 2 different law firms. So thanks again for having me. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much. And last but not least, Sky.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back. So as Katarina said, my name is Sky Parr. I'm an HB alum. So hey, everyone, in the Madison office and later on the link, practicing labor and employment. And so it was a great time. But one of the things that I really wanted to do was not just react to litigation and things like that, but really be proactive in the space of labor and employment and really look at DEI policies and practices that could mitigate some of this litigation. And so I co-conceptualized the workplace DEI practice group, which I see Katarina's leading. So that's amazing to see how far it's come. And from there, I joined C Street Advisory Group, really digging into DEI consulting full time, where I would go in, strategize, align a lot of our C-suites, key stakeholders with companies that we were working with to really work on their DEI alignment, but then their overall strategies going forward in programming. And it's great. And then after that, I'm actually on my own. I'm starting my own shop where I'm really doing DEI full-time in consulting. So I'm so excited to be part of this conversation, and let's get started.
That's incredible. Welcome back, Sky, and congratulations. As you can all see, we have a powerhouse of a lineup here today, and I'm so excited to learn from these 3 incredible professionals. Before we dig into the substance, we're just going to go over our agenda and cover a few key terms just to lay the groundwork for today's discussion. So first, we'll go into some definitions and key concepts. Then we'll have our panel discussion, and then there's going to be some poll questions sprinkled throughout that I encourage all of you to participate in. So first, let's talk about the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they get thrown around a lot. And I think there can be a misunderstanding of what these words actually mean. And so oftentimes when we use the words diversity, we're referring to racial and ethnic diversity, but that's just far too narrow of a definition. And so when you're thinking about diversity, it should encompass several different dimensions, including your personality, your language, your learning style, your life experience. Are you a Gen Xer? Are you a boomer? And then your group and social differences like your race, ethnicity, class, gender, etc. All those protected classes that you see listed under Title VII, as well as cultural and other affiliations that might not be protected on a federal level. And then when we're talking about equity, we're talking about a state where everyone, regardless of their background, has a level playing field. And I'll provide some examples of the difference between equity and equality on the next slide here. And then finally, inclusion, which is the degree to which diverse individuals are able to fully engage in organizational processes. An important component of that is being able to do so while you bring your authentic self to the workplace without having to mask your cultural identity. So I think another misconception that you'll see is that equity and equality are actually the same thing, but they're quite different. So equality in the workplace is treating everyone the same. So everyone is given the same blanket of rules and privileges, but there's no focus on the unique demographic related needs of your workforce. Whereas equity in the workplace involves identifying the specific needs and requirements informed by demographic traits. And so you address differing needs of your workforce by bridging a gap. And so the example I like to use is your parental leave policy. So say, for example, the way your policy is currently drafted, you have a maternity and a paternity leave policy. That policy, just by language alone, is going to leave out an entire class of individuals who may also be parents. Does that policy only allow leave for biological parents, for example? So you are providing this, it's the same policy applies to everyone, it's an equal policy, but it's not equitable because not everyone is covered by the policy or will receive the same treatment from the policy. So those are just a few quick key terms. Now we're going to turn over into some of this substantive discussion today. But before we do so, we're going to ask you to complete a quick poll for us. So, does your organization have a formal diversity, equity, and inclusion policy or strategic plan? You can answer yes, no, or unsure, and we'll just give you a few seconds here to fill that out for us. Okay, we're getting some answers in. Give you a few more seconds. All right, looks like the changes are slowing down. I'm gonna go ahead and show you these results. So 81.6% yes. That is a bit surprising, honestly, but really, really exciting that so many of us joining today have some sort of strategic plan or diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And obviously that's the first step when you're talking about DEI in the workplace, but it's a really, really good start. We've got 8.2% no and 10.2% unsure, and that's okay too. We're all a work in progress. So even if you've got that policy in place, it's not the last of this discussion, right? But you know, potentially this is something that your organization may want to consider, particularly after you hear from all these incredible individuals today and their insight on these topics. Okay, so to start us off, I think one of the most challenging questions that we get and that we hear quite often is, how does an organization get started with implementing DEIA policies? And when I say DEIA, I'm referring to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, or belonging. So you'll hear me refer to those terms interchangeably. That's what I mean. And so Sky, could you tell us a little bit about what companies can be doing if they have nothing in place, they're just trying to get off the ground?
Yeah, thanks for that, Katarina. So really, the way I approach it is it must start from the top, right? We go to the C-suite, we go to the board, and we really ask them, a lot of times they may not know those definitions of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, right? You have to get everybody on the same page and really, what do they see for the company? What are their business objectives, and really align their next steps with their business objectives. Because if they're not aligned, things are just going to fall apart, right? And so we do these things called alignment sessions, where we get in there and build the foundation of those terms, unconscious bias, things that may have floated around their universe, but really get everybody in the same room and build a foundational knowledge of what this actually means. And then going from there, we say, all right, let's dig into the data. If you don't have it already, let's figure out what's going on with the employees. And so a lot of times after that, we dig into qualitative and quantitative analysis. So qualitative on that side, focus groups, informal interviews with key stakeholders, and really get into what's the landscape, what's going on, where are people starting from, what are their thoughts about DEI or DEIA in general. And then we also do a quantitative analysis through surveys using maybe Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or different kind of tools in that way to really build and see what we're working with. And then taking all of those and making targeted approaches on practices and policies that need to be put in place to move forward. And so, yes, there are a lot of best practices out there with DEI, and there's a lot of things that you could do just to say, hey, build a diversity statement, hey, build EEO policy, right? but it's not going to work unless it's tailor made to the company that you're working with. And so a lot of times using that data to inform what is really going to work, and what do the employees want to see happen, and what would make their lives better and easier, and maybe, you know, be retained for much longer. And so that's kind of the approach when we start a DEI, implementing DEI policies and practices.
Thanks so much for that, Sky. Yeah, I know at least internally here at HB, we're always hearing data, data, data. You know, we just had a presentation yesterday actually from our Chief Diversity Officer where she discussed, why do you always hear us talking about data? It's because it's so critical. You don't know what improvements you need to make until you know where you are, right? So that's kind of that benchmarking process. Melissa, did you have anything to add from your in-house experience?
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree with everything that Sky just said. I think, you know, and we'll talk a little bit later in the program as well about kind of who should be at that table once you have that buy-in from the C-suite, from the CEO, and, you know, how ensuring that those individuals, to the extent you, like some of the folks on this call, don't have a DEI program already, you know, how you can start that in a way that can make you more likely to be successful more quickly. And then for individuals who already have one, you know, kind of taking a pause, maybe mid-year or whatever it is as legal counsel, and ensuring that you get all of those people at the table. And even, you know, consider starting, for example, a monthly meeting with certain stakeholders who can talk about the types of things that they're hearing in the workplace. Ensure that, you know, to the extent that there is, you know, any sort of root cause that needs to be addressed, that can be addressed. So, you know, things like thinking about getting, you know, your legal counsel, you know, somebody from ESG, if you have an ESG program, somebody from HR, somebody from DEI, all at the table to be kind of talking about things, having an agenda, and thinking through how you want to approach your goals and hopefully meet them, and getting on the same page can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for adding that additional content, because I think it is very important to hear from in-house perspective too, right? Sky has experience as in-house and private, and now she's starting her own business. And so hearing it kind of from all these different perspectives is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And I think another critical question that we need to ask for all the attorneys in the room is, what is the legal landscape that companies have to be aware of when they're implementing DEIA policies and practices? Because I know there's some tension right now in the United States with some of these practices, and I'm sure many others are aware of that as well. And so we'd love to hear a little bit more about what that legal landscape looks like.
Yeah. So I think, you know, there's generally two things to keep in mind. The first is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and really, you know, ensuring that your policy is in line with that. And, you know, what you think about there is, does the policy treat anyone more favorably or less favorably based on a protected characteristic? And to the extent your answer is yes, maybe, yes, a little bit, there's potentially some risk associated with that. And that's a risk that the company needs to, number one, be made aware of, and number two, determine whether or not they want to move forward with that, or consider whether, you know, they want to massage things in order to either potentially escalate the risk and also potentially the reward for additional additional help in terms of, you know, creating kind of more of a diverse workforce, which, you know, could be a goal, and they could be okay with that risk, or not, and, you know, pulling back maybe on certain things, certain levers, but still hopefully, you know, with that same goal, or going more slowly to achieve certain goals that the company may have. So that's, you know, of course, the first to keep in mind. The one where we're seeing a lot of, I would say, movement right now is within state laws. Certainly, you know, state laws will have their own discrimination. States will have their own discrimination laws that we need to be made aware of. They're all different. A lot of them closely tailored after Title VII, but certainly want to keep those in mind. And then additionally, in terms of sort of the recent things that we're seeing in the news, state laws that, frankly, you know, seem to have some political motivation as well. So the one that I think a lot of folks have heard about is the Stop Woke Act out of Florida. And, you know, when we look at, in that case, at least, the actual text of the law, while a politically sort of divisive name, when you read the actual text of it, it's pretty recognizable quickly that it's generally in line with Title VII. Doesn't materially differ from what is required of employers in general. So an example of that is that, employers under the Stop Woke Act, employers cannot require training that teaches anyone race is morally superior. One race is morally superior. Training could not also indicate that certain individuals should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by others with the same characteristics. So those things would be true under Title VII as well. And it's important, given the political landscape associated with these laws, that we really focus in on what are they actually requiring of us. And employers, can achieve that by taking a look at what the text of the law says, and then comparing it to what their DEI program looks like, whether or not their trainings are required. That's really a key component to that law in particular. And what's the content of them, to the extent you have employees in Florida. And then a final question, is your employer okay with the risk, to the extent that there, may be a question about whether you're violating the law? Some employers would say, we're on the right side of this and the risk is okay with us. Other employers would say, no, we're going to cut this back a little bit. In fact, cutting it back doesn't really change the flavor or the fabric of the training, so we're okay with that. So those are the types of things to be kind of on the lookout from a legal landscape perspective. A couple other things to be thinking about as well. We just talked about the collection and processing of employee data. Certainly privacy laws are a significant factor and continue to be so as we move along. And I think, different states are getting involved in terms of what their privacy laws look like as it relates to employee data. So being considerate of that is important. And then, consideration of factors, as we talked about a little bit before, like race and gender, for example, in employment decisions. So reverse discrimination can be certainly an issue, and a lot of companies have seen reverse discrimination claims come across and to their legal departments in the last several years. And then, targets versus quotas, this age-old issue of companies who want to increase numbers of diverse employees, but then, is that really a quota? So a lot of the factual questions that would come along with that if you're in litigation is, for example, did the manager feel pressure to comply with this number that's out there? Or was there any punishment for not meeting it? Those types of things are really important for companies to be thinking about when they're either creating a new DEI procedure or policy, or even building out an organization, or if they're dusting theirs off and saying, okay, how's this been working? Is there things that we could do to change this right now? Do we want to be more aggressive? Do we feel pretty comfortable with where we're at right now? A lot of times the legal review of those types of things can be helpful. And I'll also note it can be really helpful for the person who's in-house, the attorney who's in-house, who doesn't have to deliver that message necessarily back to their DEI group, their HR group, their CEO. And having outside counsel can sometimes be really helpful in those discussions and coming back with some ideas about how we could change things, or options generally about how things could be changed or the needle could be moved, depending on the different cast of characters within the organization.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. And I would just add that, I think there's a bit of risk on both sides, right? If you don't implement some sort of DEI policy, which often encompasses, cultural consideration training, implicit bias training, you might have employees in the workforce that are thinking it's acceptable to make inappropriate comments that may rise to the level of harassment or some sort of discrimination claim. And then on the other end, if you do implement a DEIA policy, are you going to see more reverse discrimination claims coming in? And even though that's a higher standard to meet under the law, right, you have to be the unusual employer in order to be liable for a reverse discrimination claim, they do still exist. And so I actually have a question for our audience related to this topic. If you would all humor me, has your organization ever had a claim of reverse discrimination filed against it? And so again, that means you have somebody of the majority filing a claim, let's say under Title VII. So it would be a Caucasian male, 35 years old, that just as an example, who files a claim against the company for being discriminated against because he is a Caucasian male. So please go ahead, yes, no, or unsure, and we'll give you a few seconds to answer that one. All right, these numbers are still fluctuating just a little bit, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds. I want to make sure everyone has time to answer. Right, almost there. 5 more seconds. All right, let's see what we got. A little over 11% yes, 30% no, almost 60% unsure. So depending on where you are within your organization, unsure is a totally fair answer. Yes, a little over 11%. So you can see that these claims are still relatively rare. I'd be interested to know if we've seen an increase in reverse discrimination claims. I can't say right off the bat, but it'd be interesting to see if over the years there has been an increase in those types of claims. And then 30% no. So again, that lends itself to the fact that these are they're rare claims. They do happen, but they're still rare. Okay. So thanks so much for providing us with that legal landscape, Melissa. And now I'm going to ask from the ESG perspective, Brooke, could you tell us a little bit about the legal landscape surrounding ESG right now?
I can. So I think just to start off kind of from a big picture, one of the first questions is really, what is an ESG law or regulation? Because especially when it comes to the G, let alone, the S or the E, this is a very all-encompassing and wide-ranging topic. So I think in a lot of cases when we deal with ESG, there is a lack of definition, which leads to a lack of understanding, which, and I'll get to this, leads to also some of the political backlash we're currently seeing in the United States. But setting that aside for the moment, because we do have certain ways, especially when we're dealing, with the operational aspects of ESG, to define it narrowly. But I'll leave it broad for now. So the ESG landscape, from a regulatory perspective, is rapidly evolving all across the world. In the United States, it's rapidly evolving state by state, as well as at the national level. And then, like I said, in other jurisdictions as well, some of which have extraterritorial application and do pull in companies that for example, operate in the EU. So I'll go through a few of these. But just to make a broad generalization first, most of the regulation we're seeing, setting aside some of the anti-ESG kind of movement, is really based on disclosure. So, it's asking companies, financial institutions, whatever the case may be, to actually disclose what it is they are doing. And in some cases, to disclose data to support those statements. So there's not at this time a lot of move to mandate sort of targets around, a net zero or other kinds of activity. It's really meant to ensure, that everyone understands when companies are saying that they're doing something related to ESG, that they're actually doing it and that they're disclosing it. So in the United States, I'll just hit on a couple because, as I said, it can be very wide-ranging as to what is an ESG regulation. But the biggest one, of course, is the SEC's proposed rule on climate disclosure for public companies, which we're anticipating to be out this spring. It would require public companies to report certain parts of their climate emissions, so scope 1, 2, and in some cases 3. So that is a big one. It will be litigated. There is similarly the federal government for federal suppliers. Any supplier that has a 50 million or more annual contract with the federal government also is going to be required to report its climate emissions. So those are two sort of very big climate disclosure rules. And I should say what we're seeing in those rules is that they pull in private sector companies on a sort of voluntary basis, because if a public company is being forced to report its climate emissions, they're asking their own suppliers, who may be private companies, to disclose their climate emissions to that public company. So when we look at our portfolio, for example, a lot of our companies who are purely private are being asked by their customers to supply climate data and other kind of ESG data to those public companies, simply so the public company can achieve its reporting obligations or desired reporting results. So we're really seeing it funnel through into smaller and privately held companies. So we're working with a lot of our companies to prepare for these public rules, even though they're not directly implicated by them. So a couple of other things to touch on in the US at the federal level is there's also an ESG disclosure rule for private funds. So that's myself. Many on the call probably not impacted by that, but similarly, we now as a private equity firm will have to report sort of how we are approaching sustainability and sustainable investing. And then, of course, many of you are probably familiar with the Department of Labor sort of ERISA rule relating to whether or not, fiduciaries may consider climate change and other environmental, social, and governance factors when making investment decisions. So those are some of the big ones at the federal level in the United States. They've become very political, especially the ERISA rule, which was in place, backtracked under the Trump administration, put back into place during the Biden administration. So it is a bit of a ping pong there. At the state level, right now we're seeing the ESG movement, the anti-ESG movement, and then the anti-ESG movement. So it's coming sort of full circle there. But just to really what it is, and similar to kind of the DEI laws, there's a lot of politicization around this in a way, that we are navigating, but from, it's 15, I believe it's 15 states at this point have passed some form of anti-ESG law, which is either, their pension funds or other, sort of state investment funds cannot consider ESG factors when sort of, investing that money, or the other form of that. So that's the anti-ESG form. The other form of that is they're asking their asset managers through whom they invest to certify that they don't boycott certain sectors of the economy. So largely coal or other fossil fuels are kind of the culprits there. So, for example, we get money from, certain states. We invest money for certain states that have these laws in place. So when we're, investing for them, they're asking us these questions. At the same time, we're investing money for states that are on the anti-ESG category, so they're asking us to certify to them that, we do, for example, screen against certain industries. So it's very hard to navigate. This is like the pension plans of cities, of states, and it's becoming quite political. In practice, as an asset manager, we have a fiduciary obligation, under a broad set of laws and, a lot of case law to abide by our fiduciary duties. And so really, when it comes down to that, that is kind of a middle line that we're finding. All of these states, we meet our obligation under all of these states, but it is definitely something to watch because more and more of these kinds of rules are coming down the pike. I want to quickly touch on, just very quickly, what's going on in the EU, because as I mentioned, some of it does have extraterritorial application, or not extraterritorial, but applies to companies that may be operating in the EU, but are not, sort of EU companies. One is a sustainability reporting directive that's coming into effect soon. It will impact EU companies, but also companies that have an annual turnover of 150 million in the EU. And there is a broad range of required reporting that has to be done under that rule. That's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Another interesting one coming out of the EU is related to their emissions trading system, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So goods that are imported into the EU are going to have an embedded carbon content to comply with that rule. That's phased in through 2026. But is, again, fairly wide-ranging because of the goods being imported into the EU. There's quite a few others that I won't run through right now in the EU, but definitely a lot going on in the EU. Similarly, in the UK, the UK has made a net zero commitment by 2050. So many of the rules that are applicable to companies, the Companies Act in the UK requires a lot of reporting coming up. Same with financial institutions. We operate in the UK. We are going to have to make a climate report in the UK under the the financial regulator there's rules. And then just to kind of close here, on 2 points. One is data quality. So when all of these companies are making these statements, they have to focus a lot on the quality of the data because different jurisdictions are requiring different kinds of either limited assurance or, sort of just a verification, or it's all different kinds of reporting requirements. And then lastly, is greenwashing. So, any company that's making public statements about this has to be very careful that they're complying with sort of the fraud and consumer protection laws that are applicable to them, because that's where, all of these greenwashing claims are and enforcement actions are coming. I will stop there, but it's quite a lot.
Thank you so much for that. It sounds like a lot of work. And so to that end, what should an ESG team look like? Who should be on that team ready to help you with all of these things that you're responsible for overseeing? Because that is just an incredible amount of work.
So on the ESG team, we think about it through both ESG governance and then ESG operations, right? And so same with what was said earlier around DEI, both at our company and with all of the companies that we work with. We first say to get someone in the C-suite on board, this is definitely something that has to come from the top, tone from the top for sure. All the time. We work, the compliance team, the COO, the COO's office, the compliance office, and even when it comes to reporting, the financial office, right? So I think it really is a whole of company approach when it comes to this, as far as the governance goes. And then the way we look at the operations, of course, depends on how the company is functioning and sort of who does what. But for sure, anyone who manages energy, waste, water, all of those kinds of things. And then, of course, DEI when it comes to sort of the S issues. And again, then throwing in the governance piece as well. So it's quite a, wide range of individuals.
Definitely a team effort. And to that end, with respect to a DEI team, Melissa, could you tell us a little bit about what your ideal DEI team might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, certainly it includes, number one, having a thought through from the lawyer's point of view, since that's who we're talking with here today. Number one, thinking about what is your DEI legal strategy? What does that look like? And then thinking about who are the players associated with that? Who are the individuals who need to be at the table? And frankly, who are your clients who you're serving through this process? Because the last thing that we want as lawyers at companies is to be the house of no, or to be thought of as, frankly, the anti-thought partner. And we really want to be creating and sustaining a partnership with everybody who should be at that table. So I would think through those things first. Depending on the company you're at and the different pieces of the organization that you might have at that company, I would think about the idea of including both the legal department, HR, ESG if you have one, and the DEI org. To the extent you have risk management, that's also potentially another faction that could be included. And then in terms of kind of thinking through, all right, what are our goals here? What are each one of these individual organizations' goals as it relates to DEI? Getting an understanding of that. And then, of course, being able to, from sort of the guardian of the organization point of view, think through the amount of risk that the organization wants to take on, depending on what they decide to do. And as you pointed out, Katerina, could be risk either way, but just understanding what the organization's goals are and connecting in the C-suite as is appropriate, whether that's, right at the beginning, that would be best to get on the same page initially. But then certainly throughout the process as you're continuing to sustain those relationships and be hopefully that trusted advisor that each one of those parts of the organization comes to when they have questions relating to legal risk or need legal analysis of something. I'm interested in Sky's point of view on that as well, just given your work with companies in the same space.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I just wanted to add in, it's interesting because various companies are at different stages in their kind of DEI journey, as I think of it. And, some companies have a full team like Husch Blackwell with a CDO and an entire team of diversity, equity, inclusion professionals, which is amazing. But other companies, may not have the same resources and kind of, have HR kind of tackle those issues in addition to their day job of whether it's sourcing talent or engaging with the employee experience. And so that's something to kind of think about when you're partnering and saying, okay, what are your roles at the company, and what do you have capacity for, because maybe it needs to be spread out a little bit more, because in this kind of, unfortunately, in the political landscape that we are in, a lot of companies are pushing DEI and I'm assuming ESG to the back burner, unfortunately. And so coming in there and saying, hey, I'm here to help, especially as a consultant, but as an attorney, as an outside counsel, as what do you need from me, because sharing that load and pushing things forward, that's the goal at the end of the day. And so some companies are a little more kind of conservative with their spending in these areas, and we have to definitely take that into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add one other thing to that, Sky, because I think that's a fabulous point. And I think one of the things that maybe some of the in-house attorneys on the call are feeling right now is really the pinch, right? In the last, call it 10-ish years, we've had companies who have really built out and invested in DEI and, put, both jobs and dollars and, really a lot of organizational thought behind DEI. And because like HR, that's really a cost center, unfortunately, even though, there's a lot of reasons why doing that is going to save you money in the future. And, there's lots of different ways we could talk about this. At the end of the day, companies are going to think about the fact that this is a cost center. And so, keeping the company going is going to be, at the end of the day, more important than certain cost centers, or, we may want to take money away from one, and that might cost some jobs and those kinds of things. So I think, that's another thing that individuals on the call may be struggling with, is that, companies don't want to take this away, but they need to, based on the economy and what's going on there. So, thinking through, okay, if that's what we have to do, ensuring that, DEI itself remains part of the company's fabric in the ways that the legal counsel at the company can ensure that continues on, despite, to the extent that there are job losses or those types of things that happen in the short term. So those are the types of things that, I'd be thinking about as well as legal counsel is, who else at the company can, if we're going to lose some talent, where can this sit and how can I help push it forward in my role?
Absolutely. And I think that can be, a good spot for a consultant to come in if you're worried about cost, because they can help you get set up and provide benchmarks for you, or even a roadmap. They don't have to be there to hold your hand the entire time, right? And so if you're not looking to engage somebody on a semi-permanent basis, you can have them come in, look at your current structure and say, here's a good starting point for you. Why don't we reconnect, in 6 months and see the progress you've made, just to hold you accountable, right? Without having to spend such a high cost for those services. So you can really get creative when it comes to implementing your DEIA programming. Not everything has to be a huge cost, because a lot of it just involves people. So thank you so much for that insight, Sky and Melissa. And so say, for example, we have our dream team, right? Our DEI dream team, or maybe even not. How can companies measure progress with respect to DEI? Could you provide some examples of that for us?
Yeah. So, assuming or not that you have a team in place and you might have some ideas, or you've done some digging into the metrics about where you're at and, what employees want to see, it's really all about measuring, it's about data, right? A data analysis. And so, for example, when you have ERGs, employee resource groups, or diversity councils, or advisory boards, right? How are those functioning? What kind of funding is allotted? What is the headcount of those groups? What programs are being administered? What are the what are the takeaways? What are the things? What can be improved, right? And so you really have to ask those questions, quarterly or as honestly as often as you can to really make sure that you're pushing things forward and improving upon every kind of question that you're asking. Same thing going for specifically, I know at Husch or at other law firms too, career progression, right? How do we have mentor sponsorship programs? How are they doing? Who's doing them? What are the pairings? What are the experiences that people are having in these pairings and conversations, right? Really getting into asking those qualitative and quantitative questions about how is it going, and making sure to stay abreast of those results to make those key improvements. And so that can be applied to anything. That could be applied to reporting, that could be or misconduct reporting, that could be applied to social impact, that could be applied to personnel relationships, right? So like everything, making sure you're getting those metrics on how things are improving, if there needs to be changes made, if there needs to be, program adjustments, they can happen. But just making sure you kind of think about it as, taking it one step at a time, because nothing's going to, be 100% when you first implement it. You have to make sure and make little tweaks along the way.
Thanks so much for that, Sky. And then Brooke, do you have any thoughts on how you can measure progress with respect to ESG?
Yeah, it's very similar. I mean, there's so many parallels between DEI and ESG, right? So similarly, first, it's a question of data and understanding the baseline. We just spent a year actually onboarding sort of an ESG data platform that allows us to kind of house in an assurable way our data on different metrics and data points, which I can get to, both at all of our offices. We can track energy spend, we can track all of the different kinds of ESG data, and then also at our portfolio companies. And they all get it for free within our portfolio, which also allows them to sort of report on theirs. So after it's the data, right, what we do, and this was mentioned earlier on when we were talking about how to set up, a DEI sort of strategy, we do the same thing. It's what is material to your business. You don't want to go after every environmental, social, or governance metric, right? But you have to decide what is my business and what is important to my business and what are my stakeholders, customers, employees, potential employees, others really looking for me to do. Then it's setting sort of a target. What are the areas I'm going to improve upon in my ESG strategy? And then, we do develop KPIs. We track them through this data management platform. And really, when we're developing those KPIs, we look at three different things. So for anything we're trying to achieve, it's KPIs around what is the objective? Do you have a strategy? Then how are you governing it? Do you have the right processes in place to ensure that you're meeting that strategy? And then what are your outcomes? So just take net zero, for example. If you set a net zero target, there's one KPI, right? Then how are you governing it? Do you have the policies and procedures in place to ensure that you're going to meet it? And then what is your actual outcome? So very similar, measuring all of those different processes along the way.
Thanks so much. And this leads to another question for our audience. Does your company have a structure or procedure in place for measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion progress? And we can even tack on ESG progress in there. So if you have either of those, please answer the poll, yes, no, or unsure, and we'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. Right, we're getting a flood of answers now. Thanks so much, everyone. Give you a few more seconds. Okay, let's see what we've got. 57.6% yes. That is awesome. 15.2% no, 27.2% unsure. That's okay. Again, this is all a work in progress. And that's what we're here to discuss today, kind of the importance of having these systems in place and why it matters. So, Brooke, you touched briefly on the interplay between ESG and DEI, and you talked about the similarities between how you measure progress. Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, so I think the way in which ESG and DEI are thought of and considered can definitely vary, by company and industry and sector, and just kind of how the culture of the company functions. But what we do, for example, is we have a separate head of DEI. I work closely with that individual, but we separate our ESG and our DEI programs just because there is, as we know from this call alone, so much nuance, so much law, so everything is so quickly moving in both places. But with that said, when we look at it holistically, DEI is a component of our S strategy as well as our G strategy. So things we look at when we think about the S, our workplace safety, employee and consumer health, labor standards, supply chain, modern slavery issues, digital privacy and security. So it all kind of overlaps, but we do consider DEI separate and distinct, but also part of the S and G categories.
Great, thanks so much. I've always known there's been an interplay, but ESG is so complex and complicated. I'm always fascinated to hear more about how the S and the G play into the DEI. So thanks so much for that. And I'd love to know from the three of you, whoever wants to speak to it, in your experience, what do you see as the most difficult part of implementing a DEI or an ESG policy or plan?
I can jump in there. I think the most difficult part is when companies think that DEI can be achieved overnight. I think that, there was a lot of kind of new air blown into, the DEIA tires in terms of, 2020 and everybody was very excited about a lot of companies taking on their own challenges, but from a consultant perspective, it gets really tough when you're managing expectations and you're saying whether you're building something from the ground up or moving forward things that are already in place, it just takes time. It takes a culture shift, right, many times to make these changes. And so a lot of difficulty comes from really, managing those expectations and the progress that we're going to see, and pushing forward through that. Because, yes, we are here and we're trying to change, do the right thing, but it takes time to dismantle a lot of the systemic barriers that were put in place for generations. And so just keeping that in mind and moving forward, that's what we all can do to, make very small steps toward where we want to be.
I really couldn't agree with that more. I think sometimes for in-house counsel who is, managing or assisting with DEI and creating a DEI legal strategy can often feel like herding cats. And one of the things that I think is really difficult to manage is expectations from the top when they think about implementing DEI and wanting to see change. Everybody wants to see change. And if that change happens overnight, oftentimes I would say it isn't sustainable. And then you have the opposite problem later where you're, in the same conversation and they're wondering why this didn't work, right? Which is bad for everybody. And also you have taken on likely quite a bit of risk. And so managing that expectation above and ensuring that from the outset that we understand that this is, years long process that has multifacets in terms of, getting folks in the door and helping retain them. How does that work? How do we do that in a functional way and in a way that is going to ensure that we have employees across the board who feel that they're working at a company that values them for who they are. And so, there's lots of different things that way that I think can be difficult to, to manage. And then I'll say the other thing is that even if you've come up with this great DEI legal strategy and everybody's on board, I'll speak to our in-house crowd here when I say that, inevitably 2 days before a board meeting, you'll be sent a slide deck that says something about what looks like a quota because we want 35% women and 30% minorities within a year. And your alarm bells are going off, and you take out all the numbers and send it back, and you're like, oh gosh, please, right? I mean, whatever you do, hopefully you have time to handle that in a better way. But those are the types of things that happen sometimes at companies where you have impatience within your C-suite or in different organizations within the company. And so, thinking through how we can manage that in a proactive way can be really helpful in overall success.
Yeah, and I can echo a lot of what was just said. I think someone asked me the other day, what is your job? And I wanted to say chief influence officer, because I feel like it's literally trying to influence people to do things that, may be new. And so it's a lot of education. It's a lot of understanding what their job is and how kind of the new and incoming ESG issues might matter to their job. Sort of making sure that everyone within the company kind of understands how, what the evolution of ESG looks like for that person. And then kind of having a coherent and consistent, general direction that we're all heading in. So it really is sort of about, corporate culture change similarly, and reorienting from a practical perspective, reorienting systems, in a new way. So every company for sure is every company has some elements of good governance or, environmental attention or social, right? And so it's just starting to think about that packaged in a new way. That's sort of a new way of communicating around those things. So, it's a lot of what are we doing already, and then putting into place the strategy with a ton of education around what that actually means and how to communicate it. And I would say I would totally echo the timeline. So, we have kind of a handbook that we have developed for companies that come into our portfolio, and sort of our just baseline ESG program development is a 2-year process that we have set out. I mean, it does not happen overnight. It takes a long time. When there's an acquisition, you have to start all over again, with kind of the new company coming in, find the new data, get all of that, so it's an ongoing iterative process, and at the same time accounting for all this new regulation and new customer demands, as new generations grow up expecting new kinds of ESG performance from companies. So it's a lot of difficulty there. And then I would just add that one challenge as well, and I assume this is the exact same for the DEI side, and I know it is from our experience, is just translating that into something that resembles value add to the company. When you don't have numbers in the same way as you do I'm in financial services, right? We're looking at EBITDA, and we're looking and kind of translating the E, S, and G, all of these kinds of issues into something that is meaningful to a business person in that context can be a very real challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I swear, Brooke, you're reading my mind. Exactly where I'm headed for these last 2 minutes. We've talked about how this can be a challenging process. It can be it can be a lengthy process. There can be legal risk involved. Why do we do this, right? Why is it important, and what are some of the benefits of implementing a DEI or an ESG program within your organization?
I can go, but we look at it for 5 reasons, and I'll be mindful of time so others can jump in. We look at it from our investor demand, our regulatory requirements, market practice. So what are our peers doing? Attracting and retaining talent. And then also, and this is purely from a business and materiality perspective, risk mitigation and value creation. So there is very real risk that if you don't appreciate it can negatively impact the business. And then there are great opportunities for value creation, or at least keeping value that you have. So whether that be evolving products or just understanding market demand. So for example, companies, if a car company is not looking at electric right now, they're probably going to be left behind, right? So it's just understanding trends in the value creation space.
Yeah, and one thing I would add, there's a ton of data out there that says, diverse and inclusive teams they have a diverse and inclusive culture just perform better, right? And, that is really, going to Brooke's point about what is the value add that you're making to, whether it's you're working in financial services or education or wherever, you want to say, okay, ultimately we want these teams, we want these employees to perform better. Like, how can we get them to trust us? How can we get them to be retained? How can we get them to be engaged? And so, really looking to those statistics and those metrics to really push that value add is also important as well.
Thank you so much. Well, that's all the time we have today. I want to thank our incredible panelists, and I want to thank our viewers today. Thanks for joining us. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching and sharing. Be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. This concludes our webinar. Thanks, everyone.